All right. Hello, everyone. All right, I think we can go ahead and jump in. Thank you to our production crew in the background, all 12 of you. Uh, okay, this is going to be an interesting Talking Serverless podcast. We are live. We're streaming on various different platforms, and we also have 3 people versus 2. So without further ado, let me go ahead and jump in. Well, first off, welcome to the Talking Serverless podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Jones, joined today by Chris Horobin and Benoit Boure. Chris is a senior developer and Typescripter at Purple Technology. Purple Technology develops apps that complement trading platforms, enabling tens of thousands of traders worldwide to trade billions of dollars worth of assets every single month. Chris has spent the past 15 years in technology, with the last 6 years dedicated to using TypeScript day to day. First off, that's a long time for, I think you're probably one of the most senior TypeScript people I've heard of. He's interested in improving DX for developers, writing advanced TypeScript, modern front-end frameworks, and of course, as we all are, trying to figure out how to optimize serverless, So we have Benoit as well with us, a staff serverless developer, AWS community builder, AWS AppSync guru, also creator of GraphQL, which is a cool platform that maybe you'll get brought up later. Actually on topic, a platform for building GraphQL APIs. Extensive experience with serverless and AppSync, which can be found on his blog. All that will be in the show notes for both Chris and Benoit. Benoit maintains the AppSync plugin for serverless framework, which is used probably the most common way that people build GraphQL APIs with serverless framework specifically. And as mentioned before, creator of GraphQL, a tool that allows developers to streamline building, testing, and debugging AppSync APIs. With that, let's go ahead and jump in. First off, Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I can't complain. I'm traveling through Florida at the moment. I'm in this, as I said in backstage, I'm in this soulless hotel room. Meanwhile, both of y'all have very amazing backsets. And Benoit, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Happy to be here and discuss this exciting topic.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we should talk about the meat of the conversation, which is tRPC. What is it? What is the difference between tRPC, REST, GraphQL? Maybe we can kick that off with Chris first, and then we can sort of do a round robin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so people who aren't familiar with tRPC, so tRPC is a TypeScript implementation of a RPC framework. So if you don't know what an RPC framework is, RPC is stands for remote procedure call, and the idea is that you are sort of calling functions over a network in a type safe manner using tRPC. So that's basically the simplicity of tRPC, is that it's more about calling functions or remote functions. It mainly focuses on browser to server communication. In our case, we're using serverless, so it's more about the browser to server communication it focuses on.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that's a great intro to it. Maybe, Benoit, do you have anything to add for the audience that maybe wasn't mentioned by Chris when thinking about tRPC in relation to maybe the more commonly known REST and GraphQL alternatives?
Yeah, I think he nailed it. It's clearly a way to have your front end communicate to your back end in a very easy and type safe way without having to worry too much about a distinguishing between two especially, I mean, if you have one team that does everything, you don't have to worry about having to agree on a contract or anything, because tRPC basically does that for you.
Awesome. And I think the very next question would be, what is GraphQL? Okay, so if we talked about REST, there's HTTP methods. It's a very standardized, long-running way of building APIs. But GraphQL is a bit newer as well. And then, of course, tRPC is the newest version, I guess, of how people are building APIs today. So do you mind giving that sort of background, Benoit?
Yeah. So GraphQL is about 10 years old already, a bit more. I think it was introduced in 2012 by Facebook, and it was later made a bit like public. Basically, it's a strongly typed way to create APIs. So you have to build a schema which represents a contract that is between the front end and the back end. And as long as both agree on it, both teams don't actually need to know what is happening in the other side, right? GraphQL was made also to try to solve two main problems that REST used to have. One was overfetching, which is basically when you are getting too much data that actually you need. So for instance, if the front end requires a user and it needs the username and an avatar, maybe it's going to call the user's endpoint, and the user endpoint might just return more things like a biography, addresses that the front end does not necessarily mean. So it was kind of a waste of bandwidth and maybe background processing the back end. And the other thing that GraphQL tries to solve is just the opposite, is underfetching. So in some cases, if the front end requires a user, then the latest orders, and from the orders, it requires I don't know, the first product that was purchased, then suddenly the front end has to do 2 or 3, even more API requests. With GraphQL, what you can do is batch everything in one single API call, and then the backend just handles the glue and stitches everything together before it returns it to the front end. And another great benefit of GraphQL is that usually, the front end will receive everything in one payload that is structured as usually it will expect. And then it just can start just displaying it for the user without having to do the stitching in the front end, because all of that is done in the back end, as I said. And yeah, I think we talked a bit about AppSync. So AppSync is basically the AWS offering for GraphQL that is fully managed and fully serverless. And that's one of the great things that I love about AWS AppSync.
I love it. I also wanted to add in while you're talking, I wanted to Google, I said tRPC is relatively new. Obviously RPC, tRPC is a TypeScript RPC. Yes. So I looked that up, and it says that Xerox actually made RPC in 1981. So REST API was around the 2000s, and GraphQL was around 2015. Just for the the listeners, about some interesting history there about all three of these. I did want to, since you mentioned AppSync and GraphQL, sort of being the mechanism for building GraphQL APIs on AWS in sort of a serverless way, right, or in a serverless way. What would be the tRPC way of building tRPC APIs on AWS? And I'll throw that question to Chris.
Yeah, so what tRPC provides is like adapters, basically, which run in any sort of like hosting environment. So they have like Edge support for Edge runtimes, or like AWS. So in our case, we're using AWS Lambda adapter. So you would specify like routers in tRPC, which basically ways of routing to particular functions based on a request from, in this case, API gateway. And the adapter just basically routes, not routes, but it kind of like hosts that router, and it like ports it from like the API gateway events to like the normal tRPC way of routing to particular functions. So you can host it in a Lambda, but it's also kind of portable as well. So it's kind of like an abstraction. And obviously the advantage of that is that there's mechanisms to call those functions directly in the same process, and there's also helpers for like SSG, SSR if you're using Next.js. And because you're just thinking in terms of functions, you can just use tRPC in the same process, as well as over a remote, like a remote procedure call from the browser. So yeah, so basically we're using the adapters. The adapters allow you to host it, and we can just use like either the REST API gateway REST API or the HTTP API, which is the newer one. So that's how it works.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I did want to ask a follow-up question there because it's still kind of confusing for me because I haven't actually built a tRPC API using Lambda and API gateway. So when you actually, how does the API gateway then send it to use like the tRPC method? And I guess like is that native support with AWS, or is that sort of, like you're sending there, you're making an API gateway that sends it to a Lambda that then's running tRPC and then sends it to other Lambda functions or inside the same Lambda? How does
no. So it's in like the same Lambda. So basically, you would have like one router or a router that's a concept in tRPC. You can have many routers if you want, but that's like a Node.js process. So it basically just given a request from to the HTTP API, it would then route it to the particular function in the Lambda itself. So you would have like one endpoint or multiple endpoints, which are tRPC endpoints, and it would just route it to like functions within that Lambda. So it's kind of like a router, if you get what I mean, within that Lambda.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely helps.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to building these tRPC APIs using API gateway, Lambda functions, what are y'all using, and what do you recommend for listeners if they're going to build, tRPC API in terms of infrastructure as code? Yep.
Yeah, so we use SST, and I would predominantly use SST for this, or CDK, mainly because we're quite like we're big like TypeScript advocates, so we would prefer that everything is written in TypeScript, and like CDK or SST provides that ability to have your infrastructure as code in TypeScript as well. It's quite easy to set up with SST. You basically just set up a API gateway or API construct and have like a function or like Lambda function. And basically within that Lambda function, you would use the AWS Lambda adapter, which basically, as described before, would route the event or request from like the event or the API gateway event.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. I can definitely see. I'm going to keep the conversation, really try to keep it away from the infrastructure as code stuff. In terms of, I know y'all have heard the podcast before. You know that I love to go through like CDK, and like serverless framework, all that stuff. But I'll try to keep it on topic and not follow up into that. But it makes perfect sense. That if you're working with TypeScript and you want to keep that 100% TypeScript. So for those listening that are doing that, definitely check out SST. I haven't used SST to very much, but it sounds like they have like a sort of a native way to build these. They're ahead of the curve on that end. The next question I wanted to kind of jump into for the audience listening, when they think about GraphQL, they think about tRPC. We'll leave off REST for now, just because it's a little bit more known. What was the biggest breakthrough in y'all's opinion with GraphQL and tRPC? And for the GraphQL component, I'll toss it over to Benoit. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the question.
Oh, no, absolutely. It may be my connection as well, so apologies for that. When it comes to GraphQL, what has been the biggest breakthrough with the release of GraphQL? And what would you say is like, this is the reason that you would use GraphQL today? Yeah.
Yeah. So GraphQL is again a contract between the front end and the back end, and just like tRPC, it tries to be strongly typed, so it doesn't allow you to do requests that are invalid to your backend from the front end. And that's I think one of the greatest benefits from GraphQL. I think to go back to what we said earlier is that in a way, essentially, tRPC and GraphQL are kind of very similar in a way, because they both act as a gateway from to your backend. They basically take a request and then route it to the backend to different functions, we call that in a way in GraphQL they're called resolvers. I don't think in tRPC, sorry, in tRPC they're called, I don't know if they're called resolvers, but they're called routes maybe. And they are responsible for resolving the data that you're fetching. So I think it simplifies a lot the way that the front and the back end communicate together, because you only have one endpoint, and what determines what you are retrieving or what the front end needs, it tells it by invoking what we call queries and mutation. And both tRPC and GraphQL have the concept of queries and mutation, where a query is essentially fetching data from the backend, and mutation is for writing data. Then we have subscriptions, and I think both support it as well, which is a great addition to what we used to have with REST compared to things like WebSocket, because subscriptions allow you to listen to live events. So it's a pub-sub subscription to whatever happens in the backend. So if you have several clients that are connected to the same API, they can all listen to the events that happen. And if one client A, emits a change through a mutation in the backend, maybe client B will receive a notification for it. So I think, yeah, these are the great benefits for, I think, both GraphQL and tRPC in this case.
Awesome. Yeah, and I definitely want to hear Chris's opinion. If you want to touch on both GraphQL and tRPC, definitely feel free.
Yeah, so I've been using GraphQL for like a number of years, mainly AppSync for 2 years. And there were some, maybe I would say, when you get into it, like some pain points when you're in a situation where you have like a monorepo setup and you're using TypeScript on both sides. You're using TypeScript on the front end and the back end, right? And the issues that we kind of encountered were, for example, with GraphQL, you have like a separate schema, and usually you have to put a lot of thought into designing that schema. So you would have like different entities or domain entities that you would write, and there's like context switching between TypeScript and GraphQL. So there's like a little bit of a difference between the GraphQL specification and TypeScript. So it's just like an additional thing someone has to learn. It's a great way of writing type-safe APIs, having a type-safe schema, especially when you have separate languages and it's like decoupled. But generally, if you're using TypeScript on both sides and it's in a monorepo, tRPC can be quite simpler in this regard. The other thing was in terms of like following dry with types. Like if generally with TypeScript, you should try to infer types and follow dry with types as well as code. and GraphQL kind of forces you down a route of repeating types. So you have types in your GraphQL schema, and you have types maybe elsewhere in TypeScript. And you also have to convert the types. So you have to convert from TypeScript types to GraphQL types, even with CodeGen, that the types are a bit different. So the types from your backend might not match your GraphQL types. You can infer the types from your GraphQL schema, but if you want to keep a domain layer, a core layer, in TypeScript, then you have to convert between the two. So that's like some ceremony. And generally, like if I want to use this exact same type in my backend and my front end, then and I want to be able to refactor something on my backend or the type on my backend, that can be reflected like from the backend to the front end using only TypeScript with tRPC. And GraphQL doesn't have this because of the extra layer. It's much harder to do this. And in terms of code gen, it becomes more difficult with like the editor, because if you're like moving between the code that's generated on the front end to like the actual code generation, it's not like jumping between the back end and the front end. I think there's some tools that allow you to do it to the schema, but it's not like totally perfect if you're using code generation, this sort of stuff. And the other thing is that the specification can be a bit limiting, I found, with GraphQL, like personally. Like there's, for example, in TypeScript, you have literal types, like string literal types. You can convert those to enums in GraphQL if you want to, but there's no way of like doing template literal types, like actual like complex string types. And you would need to convert it like to and from the enum. And it's actually much easier just to use the same types as you have on the back end, which is what tRPC does. So you're not losing type safety if you're using tRPC, where the GraphQL, you lose a bit of type safety with stuff like literal types, like a string is a string in GraphQL, where in TypeScript, a string can be like a number of literal types as well. So that's kind of the restriction. And also GraphQL kind of forces you to like rigorously separate types, like output types, input types, where with tRPC, you can use like Zod schemas if you, and Zod's quite good with like reusing schemas, that you can reuse output and input schemas. And TypeScript has many type utilities like pick or mid that allows you to generate new types from existing types. So generally, like following dry, if you want to follow dry with your types, it's harder to do it with GraphQL. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to switch. Another issue is in terms of which is kind of more to do with performance, but it's maybe like more how we were using AppSync. So we had to use like Lambda integration quite heavily with AppSync. And what ended up happening was that when a user went to a screen, we would like query multiple like fields in the schema, and it would basically trigger multiple cold starts, basically. And this is avoidable in tRPC because you have like routers, and you can kind of split the routers how you want. So you can kind of like have an individual router for everything that you have on one screen, or another router for another screen, and use separate lambdas for that. And you can split it the way you want to. With AppSync, you can solve this probably through like, I think with JavaScript resolvers, like if you want to use like have no cold starts in general, you can use JavaScript resolvers or like direct service integrations. But the problem we had with that was also like TypeScript. So like generally the TypeScript support is not as good. You have to like type, you have to like declare the resolvers, like request and response resolvers generally, manually, and the more types you write in TypeScript, the less actual like type safety there is. You have to get true type safety, you have to infer mostly. So that's another reason. And I think like generally we were using like Amplify to talk to GraphQL, and this was quite a large dependency, and we wanted to kind of move away from that anyway, and it caused like cold start issues with also Next.js. So there's quite a few reasons why we decided that it would be a better fit for us. Generally, like we are in a situation where all of our code is TypeScript anyway, so we didn't hit like those issues or language barriers because we're trying to keep things in TypeScript.
I see. Yeah, that's really awesome. I want to do like sort of a back and forth between both of y'all. I think one thing that is useful right before we get to that is probably talking about how do you host it, like the code for this. So I was doing some research previous to this, and I was reading that the code for the backend and front end with tRPC has to be co-located. I don't necessarily understand exactly what it's saying there, but when we think about a repository of code, does that mean that the front end and the back end have to live together in that repository? What happens if you don't have that set up? Does that even matter?
Yeah. So if you're right that basically it's made primarily for a monorepo setup. So the idea really is that your front end and your back end kind of live in the same repository, and that's where it's like best, because you can, for example, make a change in your like API, the tRPC side of it, and that change kind of ripples through to the front end immediately. If you get to a point where you've got that separate, like it's separate, you're getting to a point where maybe you have to start publishing the types, the TypeScript types for tRPC, or you're using the open API stuff which is an open source thing, I believe. With tRPC, it can support open API, so you're generating types from the open API as opposed to reusing the GraphQL, the tRPC types, the router. So generally, it works best that way. And the way tRPC works is it's obviously on the type level. So it works not during runtime, it works during like dev time, which is pretty important. So the client will like import the type from the backend, which is like the main router for the app. And basically you use that type on the front end, and it was able to infer all of the endpoints and all the functions that you need to call on the back end. So it's the connection is purely like a TypeScript level. It doesn't exist really at runtime because it's talking over a HTTP basically. So it's using its own sort of JSON protocol for that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. And I think one piece that you mentioned is that it sounds like the cleanest way to use it is a monorepo setup. If you were in a multi-repo setup, then as you were saying, you have to generate an open API sort of schema, then the types are inferred off of that. Is it kind of fair to say that if you go towards a multi-repo, it can get a little bit more messy in how the types are, is there like a scripting component that comes in at that point, or what is?
Well, we don't use it in this way.
Okay.
I would say that it's not like a challenge I've had to solve yet, but I think it's doable. It's just at that point, you maybe should evaluate whether it's maybe the right, the right choice to use it. But generally, it really does depend, because if you're like the primary user of your API is your team, that you have control over it in your repo, then it still might be worth using it, even if a different team uses the API, if it's like an open API spec or whatever. If they're not using it heavily, like, it depends, because sometimes the productivity benefits that it gives you might be worth the extra pain that to use like an open API, or to actually publish the types. So like, we don't do this, but like, it's definitely like a possibility. I don't think it's like totally closed off in terms of like using multi-repos. It's just, it shines like with monorepo.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
And I want to ask the same thing to Benoit here when thinking about GraphQL and the proper, or not proper, obviously you can do things in any way that you want with programming. You just might have a harder time. What is your preferred way to, build GraphQL APIs, host the code of it? What does your setup look like?
Yeah, so usually, well, the point of GraphQL maybe is just the opposite of tRPC, is that your front end and your back end might be separate. They might be in the same repo. That's not a problem, but it can be separate, and you don't have to enforce that they are together or anything. Basically, the way that AppSync shines is when you have two different teams. For instance, as opposed to tRPC, where you probably have a full stack developer or several full stack developers together. With GraphQL, you can split those teams completely, and they only need to agree on the schema. Then, well, the front end, whatever language they use, they can use the schema to generate their own typing. It could be TypeScript, but it could be something else. It could be Swift, or it could be Flutter, or anything else. So the way I usually do AppSync, well, it really depends on the project and what I do. If both front-end and back-end and both use TypeScript, I will probably put it in the same repo as well. If there is maybe more than one front-end, so you might have a web app, you might have a Android app, a iPhone app. In those cases, it might make more sense to just split them together. To split them into separate repos, and then separate all the code and the different logic that they have. I think, Chris touched on it, but the way I usually use AppSync or GraphQL with TypeScript is that I use CodeGen. So I always prefer myself to be schema first, as opposed to TypeScript first. So in my case, I define my schema as I need, and then from it I can generate TypeScript code using a library. It is true that there are a lot of limitations on this. Chris mentioned the literals, but yeah, that's something that you have to deal with usually. And I think 99% of the time it's not usually a big deal. Now, it's true that also the mind shift between TypeScript and GraphQL also played me some bad tricks, like defining an array in TypeScript and GraphQL is different. And they both have a different meaning if you do it the same way. So A quick example would be that if you, in GraphQL, you have to define an array, you put your type in square brackets, but if you do that in TypeScript, it has a different meaning. It just means an array with one element of that type. That played me some tricks more than one time, I think.
It's also like inverted in terms of like the optional stuff. So like
Yes.
TypeScript, you have to declare that, okay, this is optional.
Correct.
With GraphQL, it's the opposite. Like you have to declare that this is not optional with the exclamation. Yeah, so it's it's kind of like the opposite.
Yeah, they are quite opposite on this. So yeah. I don't know what else to say about this. I think usually typing will be a bit more of a pain, but I mean, usually your schema will evolve over time, of course, and you just only have to think about it when it changes. The rest of the time, once your types are generated, I tend to commit them in the repository, and then I start using it everywhere in the front end and sometimes in the back end as well. If I use a Lambda resolver in the case of AppSync, or a JavaScript resolver using TypeScript, you can use both. You can use types in both ends to define resolvers and the front end responses and variables and whatnot. But apart from that, my experience with TypeScript and GraphQL has been quite good so far.
Amazing. Yeah, I did want to. I love the back and forth dialogue, so let's definitely do more of that as we're coming to, the final half of the episode. I think we should do some scenario-based questions because that's probably interesting for those listening. So let's say team of 1 and team of 5+, and what would you use to build out? Let's say a web application, REST API, or sorry, not REST, web application. We're using React for the front end. We're trying to figure out the best way to build it. We're a team of 1. We're a team of 5. We're both using TypeScript as well. So Benoit, what would you do for the team of 1 and the team of 5? And
it depends again. In the team of 1, if you're just using TypeScript everywhere and you're using only front end as a web app, tRPC might be a great option. It's going to simplify everything. You're going to work faster, and it's going to be much easier. Team of 5, well, it depends. Again, if it's a team of 5 full stack developers, again, tRPC might be the best for you. If you have, I don't know, 2 backend and 3 front end, and they don't like to talk to each other too much, well, then GraphQL is the best option. They just need to agree on the schema, and that's it. Now, I said it depends. It depends on what? Well, on your needs. There are many things that GraphQL shines at. If you have a highly connected data that you want to explore as a graph, that's where GraphQL shines. I don't know how tRPC handles that, but GraphQL handles that pretty well through resolvers. And the data does not even have to be in the same data source. So if you have, for instance, let's say a get user which fetches data from DynamoDB, and then you have find user that uses OpenSearch, GraphQL and specifically AppSync is great at that because it just connects to all the data sources that you need very simply, without having to write too much code, instantiating clients in the backend and whatnot, because AppSync connects to it directly. I don't know. That's my take on this so far.
Yeah, so I maybe have a similar opinion. I would maybe say that the number of people is not really what changes this for me. Like generally, if people are working in the same repository using TypeScript for both sides, tRPC is like a good option. If you're talking about multiple teams that require like different repositories, maybe that they have to be autonomous, but at the same time require the same API dependency that need exactly the same data, then GraphQL might be a better option. But in terms of like integrating between teams, there can be like different options for this as well, because the teams also might want to own their own data, and therefore they might want to like have some async option to sync like the data between the two teams, and they have their own APIs and are more autonomous this way anyway. So it really depends. Like, for example, like I think GraphQL works really well when you have possibly the situation where you have a direct port like mobile apps that you want to basically create the same app in like a mobile as well, and it's the same data requirements, but it's like a different language that you're writing it in, for example. So I think like GraphQL is a really good option for this, because you're staying type safe. You have a type safe API, but like you have different programming languages going on. It's not just like TypeScript. So generally, yeah, I think that's where GraphQL is pretty good. Like generally, for me, I prefer if we try to break down those barriers in the first place, that basically that my preference is that we all use the same language, so that people can like contribute to both sides, like the idea of full stack development. And I think like having separate languages unnecessarily can cause problems with this. So there's like obviously more of a complication in terms. It's more complicated than like this team wants to use what X language, this team wants to use Y language. It's usually like why do they want to use separate languages in the first place? Maybe there's valid reasons for it, like mobile apps, but generally, for me, it's I would try to stick to like one language because it's easier.
Yeah. You mentioned mobile apps, and I forgot to mention that as well.
Yeah.
It really depends on how you think your app will evolve. Because if you start with tRPC and suddenly you want to evolve it to your startup or your company grows, and you say, okay, well, we're going to launch a mobile app, and then you want to use something that is not TypeScript because you want to be native with Kotlin or Java or Swift, then suddenly it could be a problem, because you're going to have to migrate everything or find a way to bridge something to tRPC. I'm not sure if that's possible and how you would do it.
So
but it could be a problem. Yeah.
There's like a open API. There's open API, so you can use it with open API and generate have code gen for open API, which is like a way of doing it with tRPC. But like, yeah, if you want to write a native app, for example, but if you want to, for example, use React Native, then tRPC can still be an option for that, because you're using TypeScript. So, and that's also like another like good way.
Yeah. And in the end, it's all HTTP.
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is really helpful. I'm starting to get a much better picture of, the trade-offs and when to use GraphQL, when to use tRPC, when you could potentially use both. I think all of us would probably say try out both and make sure that it makes sense for your specific team and what you're trying to do. Let's take a really hard example, maybe like the most messy thing that we deal with, which is I'm an existing company, we've got a bunch of stuff going on, potentially different languages, but we have some interest in TypeScript. We're thinking about unifying that. It's complex. I guess, like, if you had to recommend, how would somebody even go about starting the process of maybe proof of concept wise for GraphQL or tRPC. And yeah, talk us through that. So, I'm the company, I'm trying to think about this. You're the consultant. You're trying to tell me maybe a route that I could take to experiment with, and we'll split it in half. So let's say for Benoit, how would you recommend going about a GraphQL sort of POC to see if it works for the company? And Chris on the tRPC end. And we can start with Benoit.
Yeah, well, there are many ways to start with GraphQL and AppSync. AppSync is so great because it's fully serverless, it's fully managed, and I think in half an hour or an hour you could easily have a quick proof of concept running and just working. There are many tutorials and on YouTube and on the internet that you can find. You will find some templates for whatever infrastructure as code that you want, serverless framework, CDK, SST, whatever. And it's very easy to start. As I said, in a few minutes, you can easily have something running. You don't have to write a lot of code, almost zero code. With AppSync, everything is managed and handled, like authentication. You can even start with just API key, which is the simplest way to authenticate against AppSync. And then that's pretty much it. You don't even need a front end. You can go in the console and start emitting queries and see how it works. So, well, yeah, that's very easy.
And Chris, what are your thoughts on tRPC, proof of concepts?
Yeah, so I mean, it obviously depends like what they're making, if it's like a web application or whatever, but if generally you're using, if they're already kind of using TypeScript or like React on the front end, then it's pretty easy to get started with like tRPC with serverless. Like AppSync is a dedicated service, so it's like everything kind of comes out of the box for you, so it's easier in that regard. But tRPC like is very easy to set up with in AWS Lambda. It's like a few lines of code to use the AWS Lambda adapter. So like the commitment would have to be that you are switching, that you would use TypeScript. That would have to be the agreement. Where GraphQL, you don't have that. Like you can continue using whatever language you want for the back end and the front end. And like, there isn't that language shift, I guess. With tRPC, it's like, if you're already using TypeScript, then it's maybe easier. But if you're like in a situation in a company where backend developers don't want to use TypeScript, or I don't think that's going to be the case for front-end developers. I'm not sure, but generally, like it might be like more of a harder to persuade those people to use it or to switch to it. So I think this depends really on the mindset of the team generally.
Yeah, that's awesome.
For us, it's easy because we already use TypeScript in a lot of places, so it's like easier it was an easier sell, like easier to make to do a shift like that. But yeah, if you have C# developers or other developers like Kotlin or whatever, and then it might be a more difficult.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to ask another follow-up to you, Chris, around Purple technology. You've said you've been doing GraphQL for a long time. You made a switch to tRPC. How has that, you've mentioned mindset a couple of times. I know that Benoit also mentioned around, thinking about the schema first, then code genning the TypeScript. Has that been has there been a positive transition from that? Has there been a weird transition at first of not thinking about the schema in that way? Like, is there no transition? Yeah.
Actually, most developers kind of understand, like, I think like they maybe are more confused about the acronym first. Like, but when you describe tRPC to someone, that you're just calling a function over a network boundary, and it's a type safe way of doing that. I mean, all developers know how like functions work, like inputs, outputs. So it's like a much easier mental model to think about for developers, even like new developers that join your team, that this is like you're just thinking about like functions basically. And for me, like this also is like a good mindset for serverless in general, because like you have serverless functions, you can like it kind of maps well together, serverless functions and like generally RPC frameworks in my mind. And also it's like with REST, for example, you're trying to also design a REST API. There's many people that do REST kind of like ad hoc, and it's like purpose driven, in which point it's kind of like RPC anyway. So it kind of falls back to RPC. So RPC is like a good, it's like an easy way to think about getting data, in my view. Yeah, it's simpler. You write a function, you call the function to get data. With GraphQL, you have to think about like actually designing a schema, right? And sometimes that pays off, obviously. Like if you have other people using that schema, it pays off. But if you're just trying to deliver or trying to get stuff done, then RPC, or like a purpose-driven way of getting data. Like I just want to get what I need. I call a function, or I create a function that's purpose-driven for that particular scenario. That kind of can be quite easy to think about.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I would love to hear Benoit's thoughts on this too. I know you're opinionated about the schema side of things and thinking through that. What are your thoughts on that when you're thinking about, hey, I'm going to build this API, or I'm going to extend an API? You're looking at the schema first. You're thinking about the TypeScript. Like, how does your brain work?
I tend to think about it as schema first in the case of GraphQL. And there are usually two ways of doing this. So you use schema first or type first. I think there are ways to generate GraphQL code schema based off TypeScript. So in that case, you define your types first, that are used both in the back end and the front end, and from it you generate your schema, your GraphQL schema. I prefer the opposite. I prefer the schema to be the actual source of truth, because that's the actual contract that is going to be between the front end and the back end. And I need to know and be certain that what that schema is, and I want to have the control on it. Because you never know what CodeGen could do. Maybe it generates something that you don't expect, and then you suddenly have to treat your types, and it's not necessarily the best way to work. I think I prefer to really start from what the front end and the back end agree on, and then they can both generate their types from it. And in the case of the front end, it actually might not even be TypeScript. So that really depends. But so yeah, for me, it's schema first, because I want to have the control of what exactly is going to be the contract between both.
I see. And I had a question based on what you're saying, which is when it comes to a new developer jumping into a project, one project's GraphQL, one project's tRPC, is one of them have an easier time than the other in terms of understanding the code base quickly? What are your thoughts, Chris?
So presuming that they already know some TypeScript, then I think tRPC is like easier. If they have some like GraphQL knowledge already, I guess then you're gonna have an easier time with maybe GraphQL. I'm not it depends on the context, but if it's like a junior developer with like less knowledge, like generally like tRPC, it's like less to learn, basically. That you're not learning how the GraphQL specification works plus TypeScript. You're learning TypeScript. So like it's less to learn, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. And same question to you, Benoit.
Well, yeah, I think he's right. I mean, if someone is new to a project, and especially a junior using TypeScript everywhere, is going to be much easier. Now, well, it really depends on what you need. If you're not going to base your architecture decisions based on who is going to join your team or how easy it is to jump on a project. It really depends on your use case, and you should just choose what works best for you and for your use case, and for what you think that your project will evolve in the future as well. Because you don't want to take decisions that work now, but not in the future.
Gotcha. And we do have a question from the audience. The question is from Dharmendra. Hello, Dharmendra. I understand it's easy to switch from GraphQL/API Gateway to tRPC, but if for some reason we are in a situation that we have to switch from tRPC to GraphQL/any other approach, how easy or difficult is that? And whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
Well, I think either way is going to be hard, I guess. It doesn't matter if you come from GraphQL to tRPC or vice versa. You will probably have to do a lot of refactoring, because just the client is going to be different, and the way to call your backend is going to be different. But overall, apart from that, maybe in the backend it might be easier. And again, it doesn't really matter which way you go, because from what I know of tRPC, it works almost the same as GraphQL, as almost it has the notion of resolvers. So it's like a function in a way that is called from the front end to the back end. But then the way that the code is made from the front end to the back end is so different that it's probably going to be tough to migrate everything. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It's going to take time.
Yeah, so generally I think that yes, like I think maybe the shift to GraphQL can be daunting, because you have to think about GraphQL tooling as well. There's a lot of GraphQL, like a lot of things for GraphQL. It's like there's many variants. So like whether you use AppSync, whether you use what like like a code gen tooling use, what client side library you're going to use. Are you going to use Relay? Are you going to use Urkel? Are you going to use Apollo? Or etc. tRPC is very opinionated in this way, that basically it's built on top of like TanStack query. So like it's more like that it's set up for the developer in terms of the client, where there's many tools around GraphQL that you need to make like decisions for. Generally, like when you set up a project, if you want to make a back end and a front end. So switching between the two can be, I would say, maybe harder going from tRPC to GraphQL, I would say, than the other way.
Yeah,
Mainly
I think
because there's less decisions to be made with tRPC.
Yeah. Great question, Dharmendra, because I think it kind of exposed another thing, which is the simplicity or the not simplicity, but the opinionated nature of tRPC. And that was a great answer, Chris. So thanks for that. Yeah, so we're coming to the end of the podcast. I think we're getting a better idea about all these different options. I guess something here would be tRPC growth trajectory. Is it just hockey stick? It's just going to keep growing. And GraphQL trajectory, is it a hockey stick as well? A TypeScript trajectory, is it also a hockey stick? What do y'all think is going to happen as we roll into 2024, 2025? If you were going to be that oracle, I guess. And I won't hold you to it. So whatever you say, it's you won't be held accountable or anything like that. Let's start with Benoit.
Well, I think TypeScript is definitely the future for many things. I use it almost everywhere now that I can, in Lambda functions, in infrastructure as code as well, in the front end. So TypeScript is there to stay, and it's going to get better and better. Now, hockey stick growth for our tRPC, I don't know. I actually don't know how long it's been around, but I know GraphQL has been around for a while, AppSync has been around for a while, and I see more and more people using it. So I think it has a great future ahead, probably tRPC as well. Yeah, I think they will both evolve in parallel, and the future will say which one gets more hype. But in a way, in the end, as we said, it depends. So I don't see them as really as opponents, but more as different options that you have that both can work in their own way.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. I guess like TypeScript and GraphQL share something that they've actually been around for quite a while now. Like both. I don't think TypeScript's going to slow down anytime soon. And like GraphQL has a lot of maturity. I think maybe what tRPC's made like people realize is that in some cases that GraphQL can be a bit like an overburden. In terms of like whether tRPC will stick around, like I think like it's been rapidly gaining popularity, but it's still not in a position where you can say like it's like totally mature or like it's not as old as the others. So it's still like you need to wait maybe to see if if it's gonna how well it's gonna do over the next number of years or so.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think that's a pretty good way to recap everything. It depends, we're sorry, it's not so easy where we can just say push a button and that's what you're going to get. So your context, your team, your company, the people that you're hiring, what you're building, whether or not you're building a mobile app or you're not, or you're using multiple languages, all those factors come together. And I would definitely say keep an eye out for Purple Technology, what they're doing, what Chris is doing. Keep an eye out for Serverless Group and Benoit, and also GraphBolt on that end about ways that are being done. It sounds like TypeScript here to stay. It's going to keep rising in popularity even more so, and the tooling that's coming out is sort of using TypeScript as that like base layer. So I think it's very interesting. I know there's a ton of stuff that we didn't have time to touch on, such as like caching, the IDE, developer velocity things with tRPC that I was reading about through articles. So final sort of thing. Last word for you, Chris. Last word for you, Benoit. What do you recommend people to get started with tRPC and GraphQL? And also, if you have anything to shout out, any events that you're going to be at, or ways that people could get in touch with you, learn about your content. So I'll take it from there. Chris, on that end.
So for me, I would actually like try out SST with tRPC. If not, like it's easy also to use Next.js with tRPC. That's pretty easy if you want to get started with it. There's many tutorials on that.
Yeah, well, for GraphQL and AppSync, if you want to learn more about AppSync, follow me on Twitter. You see my handle on the screen. My blog, I talk a lot about AppSync. And yeah, try out, if you try AppSync, try out GraphQL, which is a tool to test, manage, debug, and yeah, test your AppSync APIs. It's sort of a postman for AppSync with everything handled for you easily. AppSync is, well, there's a lot of tutorials online as well that you can find to get started. And if you have any question, hit me on Twitter or my blog through my email, and I can help you out without any problem.
Amazing. Okay, well, for those watching, you can see the Twitter handles for both Chris and Benoit here. Any additional questions, definitely reach out to them. I think we have, a lot of great expertise between both of them on this entire topic. So, flood them with messages. I would say flood them before flooding me, because, I might flood them with your question. So with that, this has been a Talking Serverless podcast live show. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Benoit, for your time today. And of course, thank you to listener. And with that, we'll come to a close.